And I wonder, Anna, should we just get started, do you think? And then everyone else, I'll just be doing some sort of housekeeping so people won't miss the first couple of minutes.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Great. So yeah, hello everyone. Welcome. I'm Sebastian Cater. I'm Head of UK Theatre and Workforce Development. Welcome to this webinar on remote working in the performing arts. Before we begin, I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping. This session should last about 2 hours long. We've set it up as a webinar, which means you can see us, the presenters, but we can't see you or we can't hear you. So the only way you can communicate is through the chat or through the questions. We will prompt you at certain times to ask a question, maybe use the chat. But obviously, if you want to use the chat at any point just to reflect on what's been said, do feel free. The facility, if you're new to Zoom, I'm sure many of you will have had to use a lot of Zoom recently, but if you're new to it, depending on your device, if you're on a desktop, there's some functions at the bottom of the screen. So that's where you can click on the chat. That's where you can click on the Q&A, and you can use those functions, as I say, to communicate with us. Questions, you can ask them anonymously if you want, or you can ask them as yourself. Either is fine. It's just a great way to let us know what you're thinking. And if you see a question that's on there that sort of asks what you were going to ask, you can just like it, and that'll sort of go up to the top of the ranking. We are recording. You might have had a notification at the start. So just to let you know that we're recording this so that more people can watch it. If you can't make the whole thing, if people that you know wanted to make it but were busy, we will make this recording available. Once it's captioned, PiPA will be sending out a link to you, and then it can obviously be shared far and wide. We've got a team. We've got Annie on standby for any technical issues, so touch wood, everything will be fine. But if you've got any issues, do just reach out to us through the chat. So I think that's it for housekeeping. I'm just going to do a brief welcome, really, just a bit of context for this work. In the spring of this year, UK Theatre, we launched our interim business plan, which was really sort of an 18-month business plan just to take us through the next sort of 12 months or so. Obviously, it was formed in the pandemic, so we didn't want to go too far because who knows what's coming. It was just trying to be quite sort of short and snappy, and really it was in response to the situation that we were all in, and really was about responding to the needs of our members and the wider theatre sector. There's various sections in there. Do have a look at it. Just search on our website for it. But there's a section on workforce and well-being, and one of the elements in there was about helping our members navigate through the whole concept of sort of working flexibly. We know that for a lot of people it's been quite challenging, and I know PiPA is going to talk about some of the challenges, but also there's a lot of positives. And really we wanted to sort of make sure that before we all started moving back into some sort of normality, we took a moment to pause and reflect on what we've all been through in relation to remote working, and if there's things that can be learned and things that can be applied going forward. So really, SOLT and UK Theatre supported this initiative. We commissioned it, but we're really happy to have partnered with PiPA on it. This work is really important to our members. We know that the report has had over 1,000 downloads just in the last couple of months. And really, we went to PiPA because they are the experts in this area. They've been doing this work for 5 years, and this is really, they know more about this than anyone. So we're just so happy to have supported them with this initiative. So really, thank you to Anna and Cassie and the team. And then we've got some people from PiPA and some other members of the board and other supporters of PiPA's work. So we welcome you all today. But now I'm going to hand over to Anna from PiPA to host the session.
Thank you, Sebastian, and welcome from me as well. It's actually great to know who's in the room as well, and to see that there's this interest in remote working in the performing arts. So as Sebastian said, I'm Anna Inaltena-Ilov. I'm the co-founder and the joint CEO of Parents and Carers in Performing Arts, or short PiPA. And I will share with you a little bit of our recent research into remote working within the performing arts, which was very much informed, obviously, by the effects of COVID, before I will then hand you over to our wonderful speakers of today, who will talk in more details about the why and the hows of remote working, as well as hearing some great live examples from the industry. So just to quickly introduce you to everybody, I'm very pleased to have with me today flexible working expert and chair of the PiPA board, Sarah Jackson, who will give us an insight about remote working in the wider industry, as well as helping us understand the business benefits. Also here today is Matt Harper-Hardcastle, who runs the PiPA Charter Programme with over 50 performing arts organisations from across the UK. And he will give us some more insights about some of the tools that can be used to make remote working work. And we're delighted to have some industry examples here today. We will hear from Debra Sawyer, the Deputy Executive Director of the Mercury Theatre. Caroline McCall is here, a freelance costume supervisor and wardrobe manager and member of CETA. And last but certainly not least, it's Kate Sirdefield, Head of HR from the Royal Shakespeare Company. So just before we start, I actually would like to get a bit of a temperature check of the room. And we have a quick poll that we would like you to take. So if we could just have the poll there for people to take, thank you. What we're asking is, how do you feel about implementing remote working or managing remote workers? Just a quick, don't think about it too much. Are you hesitant because you don't think remote working is possible in your line of work? Are you nervous because you don't feel you know enough about managing remote working? Do you feel positive but unsure of how to make it work effectively? Or are you confident because you've got some knowledge of how to make remote working work, but you want to learn more? Or do you feel experienced because you have got the tools and you know you can manage remote working successfully? So just give us a little click. Oh, I think it's already gone. At least I can't see it anymore. However you feel today, we hope that by the end of the session, you will feel better equipped to understand how remote working works. That's a lot to say, and how it could work for you and for your team. So we're going to do the same poll in the end again, and then we can see where we are basically. So just to start, there are many prejudices and concerns around remote working, and we want to help to unpick some of those. And as part of this, as Sebastian said, we have created a comprehensive remote working toolkit that you can freely download from both the PiPA and the UK Theatre website. We'll put the link of it in the chat again, which should help you address some of the concerns around remote working, but also give you some really practical tools to help you implement it, which includes like a sample policy, but also a very handy checklist that you can use. And one of the most common attitudes towards remote working is, of course, that being in the live entertainment industry, working in the performing arts, doesn't actually lend itself to remote working. And to unpick this, we first need to understand what remote working is and what forms it can take. Sarah will talk about this a little bit more later, but I just want to give you, just to put us all in the same sort of frame of mind. Remote working is a form of flexible working, and it may cover anything from working from any other premises, from working from home, from a different office building, or from a cafe, or even from a train. Remote working basically enables people to carry out their work activities away from the organization's building or main offices, so working off-site rather than on-site. And this already proves that remote working is indeed actually quite ingrained in the performing arts, given that touring plays such an important part within many performing arts organizations. Also to remember is that remote working doesn't have to mean working away from the site all of the time. In fact, what we will be focusing on today will be a hybrid or blended model of working, where some part of the job could be carried out from home or elsewhere, whereas the other part stays in the venue or in the organization's building. So this summer, we conducted a survey around remote working, which found that nearly 7 out of 10 respondents would like a blended model. So the flexibility to carry out part of the work in the workspace and part of the work remotely or from home. And an additional 18% recognize that although their job is traditionally carried out on site, there are actually elements that could be delivered remotely. So this suggests that the mixed or blended model of remote working, meaning off-site and on-site, is a more desired and potentially more suitable model for the performing arts. But even before COVID, there were many examples of remote working from our sector. Stage managers sending rehearsal reports from home, production managers answering emails on transit, costume alterations being carried out somewhere away from the venue. But often these approaches are quite ad hoc and not always recognized as remote working. But understanding which part of the job can be delivered away from the organization's building is actually the first step to enable better flexibility. And this is something that Matt will talk about in more detail later. Lockdown had forced many performing arts organizations to enable remote working, specifically working from home, as we know, due to the complete shutdown of the performing arts industry. And in this time, many organizations, for the first time, enabled, where possible, their teams to work from home. And they had to quickly find and adapt to the technical requirements to enable remote working. The sector and its workforce had to completely innovate and adapt around the venue closures, around furlough, around working from home, even moving some of the productions online. And if anything, the pandemic has actually shown that there is capacity for remote working within many roles that we didn't consider before in the performing arts. However, it is important that we remember that working from home that we experienced during lockdown is very different of what we would consider successful remote working. These were emergency measures and they were implemented at a very short time where children had to be homeschooled, where care providers were closed, where it was difficult to get webcams and laptops at last minute, and all these working remotely arrangements were set up not with the care and the consideration that is actually required to support the managers as well as the remote workers properly. The challenges that people experienced through this time were the lack of boundaries between the domestic and the working life. Obviously, when you have children at home or you have to care for your mother whilst trying to work, as well as feeling isolated and disconnected from your work team or from your work, which is all very much linked also to lockdown. So it's very difficult to take them apart. However, despite the challenges, many of the known benefits of remote working were actually still experienced both by the workers and by the managers by working differently, which included better work-life balance, reduced stress, more focused time, and less expenses such as the travel expense to go to the venue or the childcare cost. And what was interesting in the survey is that despite all these challenges, working from home during lockdown, most managers didn't feel that remote working negatively impacted the productivity of the team. 89% of managers that we surveyed felt that their teams had been as productive, if not even more productive, whilst working from home. And although the managers experienced these challenges, like finding it harder to support their teams remotely or wanting more training and resources to do it properly, 98% said that it was still considered continuing to manage remote workers, which is great news for our industry because it means that there was a lot of learning, which if we supported properly and embedded in organizations' long-term strategy, could mean a shift in our working cultures that would enable better work-life balance, not just for parents and carers, but for everyone. Just before I finish, one of the benefits of remote working, which Sarah will talk about in more detail, is the opportunity to attract and retain a wider talent pool. The overwhelming majority of our survey respondents, 91%, agreed that offering some form of remote working would make a new job more attractive, quite important right now in our job market. And this number increased to 94% of disabled respondents, highlighting the role of remote working in attracting and retaining a diverse range of talent and of perspectives. But now I'll hand you over to Sarah, who will talk much more about the business benefits of remote working. Sarah, over to you.
Hello, and thank you very much. So I just want to start by defining our terms more precisely perhaps than Anna did, just to say, look, I'm going to talk about the business benefits of flexible working, not just remote. And flexible working simply means a job that's not done Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 on your premises. It aligns with the needs of your organization and also with the needs and preferences of your employee. And the arrangement may be formal, in other words, contractual. It could be informal, or it can be a blend of the two. So an example of that could be a part-time office-based contract, but the informal ability to work from home as and when. But essentially what you're talking about is varying where, when, and how long. And that means that there are actually many different kinds of flexible working. I mean, where is what we're talking about today. How do you make work that's off-site work for your organization and for your people? When is things like flexi-time and split shifts and compressed working weeks and so on. There's many kinds of when. And how long, actually, there's only two kinds of how long. Part-time is the obvious one, and then job sharing. And in job sharing, the role remains full-time for the organization, but two people split the time and share the responsibilities. Now, I've been supporting employers and researching flexible working for more than 25 years. And when you get flexible working right, there are clear business benefits, because at root, it's about performance. And what this quote here is from the group CEO of Barclays Bank. So he's not in a business that does flex because it's simply a nice thing to do. But here he is saying that enabling people to decide when, where, and how they work helps increase engagement and productivity. And I think that's the magic bit. It's enabling people to decide, That's the essential ingredient. And you can see immediately, therefore, that this is actually more about culture than about policy or rules. Choice and control is what bring results. And flexible working itself is essentially just a means to that end. It's a tool, it's not the end in itself, because the end game is performance and productivity. So I'm going to review the business benefits, and we can group them under four broad headings, which are performance, looking after your people, retention and progression, talent and attraction. So if we start with performance, flexible workers are more likely to be engaged, and engaged workers potentially generate up to 43% more revenue and improve performance by 20% compared to disengaged employees. And it's important to note that 9 in 10 employees consider that flexible working is a key motivator to their productivity. And then it's also about the importance of diversity for performance. Flexibility is an essential support for diversity, and diversity drives performance. There's consistent evidence from the business world that companies that are more diverse are more profitable. Diversity in leadership is absolutely vital to business success. It contributes to better decision-making, better performance. And to get diversity in leadership, you need diversity at every level of an organization. And what works for business reads across to the performing arts and to the creative case for diversity, where flexible working arrangements can help to create a more inclusive and diverse working culture by removing barriers and enabling access and progress. So then looking at the three other areas where flexibility drives business benefits, looking after your people, retaining, progressing and attracting the best talent in the first place. If we think about well-being first and looking after your people, the pandemic has absolutely underlined the importance of supporting the health and well-being of your people, and the PiPA survey findings underline this. Work-life balance is good for overall mental and physical well-being. And flexible working allows employees to, for example, manage disability and long-term health conditions or caring responsibilities. And this can also reduce the incidence and costs to you of planned and unplanned absences. And parents and carers, especially those on low incomes, the ones who benefit the most, they tend to have increased well-being and are less troubled by stress when they're given access to flexible work. And for all, across your whole workforce, feeling in control reduces stress. And that's important because stress is the #1 cause of work-related ill health in the UK. And stress also reduces our ability to make good decisions or to risk innovation. Moving on to retention and progression, obviously it's expensive to replace people. Plus, high churn has an impact on team morale, on external relationships, and on productivity. But flexible workers are loyal. Their higher levels of engagement, which they experience because of the flexible working, have been shown to reduce staff turnover by up to 87%. And then thinking about how you're bringing people into your organisation, only 2 in 10 jobs that are advertised today mention flexibility, and yet 9 in 10 job seekers are looking for it. So let's talk about managers. You know, not every manager is going to be keen on remote working becoming part of the organisational norm, because just if you think that it's 60 to 70% of employees or people are saying that they want to come back, but actually, just as with all employees, some managers are not going to have enjoyed working from home. They're going to be really looking forward to getting back on the premises full time. Other managers are going to have concerns about managing their teams on a remote or dispersed basis longer term. So do think about what support and training you can put in place for your managers, and do communicate that this will be provided to support the rollout of remote working, and communicate that to staff as well, because that will reassure everyone that your organisation is invested in making remote working a success, that it's not going to be a kind of ad hoc, we're going to slide into this. And it's also going to reassure individual people who may be worrying that they want to use remote working, but their own manager isn't going to be very keen on supporting them to do so. Then there are particular risks that may result from remote working if your managers are not fully on board and well trained, and out of sight, out of mind should be top of your list there. Remote and part-time workers can already suffer from being overlooked or from being thought less committed than those full-time on the premises. So do make sure that you've got processes in place to track work allocation, performance appraisal outcomes, and promotions against working patterns, including the use of remote working. And think too that women in particular may choose to make more use of remote working than the men in your workforce, because women tend still to be the primary carer in any family. Thus, there's also a gendered out of sight risk. So again, make sure that you're recording and monitoring work allocation, performance appraisal outcomes, and promotions against gender and the use of remote working. And then the third challenge to be thinking about is teams and connectedness. So you have to put communication at the heart of the new remote working approach. A good comms plan is going to be absolutely essential so that everybody in the organisation understands how remote working is going to be introduced, trialled, and evaluated, and thus to manage and assuage worries and uncertainties. However, I would say, don't be afraid to share any uncertainties that you do have currently at senior level or within the organisation. Because one thing that really I did learn from talking to employers and staff members during lockdown is that people actually prefer to have regular developing updates than to have to wait for the perfect answer in times of change. So do share uncertainty. And then think too about developing team protocols to help deal with concerns and to establish a common understanding of what flexible working means and how it's going to work for each team. What this means is empowering people within their teams to address the core operational requirements, to think about communication and boundaries and team issues and working together as it will work for them in their teams. And Matt can provide you support around developing team protocols like this, and the new remote working resource covers this too. Now, look, I want to end now on the latest development around flexible working. I mean, as you know, anyone who you have employed for at least 26 weeks, who is an employee, who's not a worker, not a freelancer, has got the right to request flexible working. That is, the right to request a permanent contractual variation in where, when, and or how long they work. Now, you've probably spotted last week in the media or in the HR press that the government is consulting on what they're calling day one or default flexibility. The first thing to say is it's not going to be default flexibility exactly, if even at all. What they're actually considering is making the right to request flexible working a day one right for all employees. So essentially removing the requirement that you have to have worked for 26 weeks before you can make a request under the law. The implications for you as employers really are not particularly significant, if we're being totally honest. I mean, let's assume that you do nothing at all in response to there being a day one right to request. It is possible that a new hire could exercise their right to request flexibility on day one through the door or shortly thereafter. And I remember back in the day, before all the right to request stuff even came in, it's happened to me. It's really annoying. But the point is, you will still be able to rely on the existing 8 statutory reasons to say no. You may find that the government shortens the time that you have to respond to and to manage any appeal from the current 12 weeks. But really the thing is that control remains with you. This is going to be a very small earthquake, and very, very few horses should be worried. To understand the policy demand, though, and what you can do to anticipate what the law is going to be doing, the policy demand has been driven essentially by the likes of me when I was chief executive of the work-life charity Working Families, and by other organisations like the TUC and the Child Poverty Action Group, and perhaps more surprisingly by the CIPD, the Chartered Institute for Personal Development, and while she was Prime Minister, by Theresa May. The original intention was to get rid of that barrier to entering the workforce for parents and carers who really can't take on a full-time role, on the off chance that 26 weeks later, they'll be able to start a successful request to reduce their working hours to align with their care responsibilities. So the CIPD is leading a campaign for there to be a legal obligation on employers to review and publicise the potential for flex of any job that they advertise, including, of course, being able to say we've had a look and there's no potential for flex here at all. Now, that would be true default flexibility. Applicants to any role would be able to see what was possible and what was on offer, and the employer would be on the front foot from the off, knowing what was possible and able quickly to assess whether the candidate and the business align in what they're looking for. Now, the new proposals are not going there. The government appears to hope that simply the fear of being asked for flexible working before 26 weeks will get employers designing and advertising it. And I suppose it might. But I think it feels like playing a very long game, given that it took 10 years to get the right to request flexible working opened up to everybody after it was first introduced, which was only for parents of young children in 2003. So from the point of view of the potential employee, it's likely to leave most people in the position that they're in now of having to raise requests for flexible working at interview or risk taking on a job that's full-time in the hope that they'll be able to negotiate a change once they're in post. And for employers, it means that most will still be cut off through their own inaction from the 90% of employed people who want flex, from the 1.5 million people who are stuck in their current roles because they need to keep the flex they've currently got, and from all the many people with care responsibilities who are currently locked out of any job that's advertised without flex. And all this is when, there've never been more vacancies being advertised. So although this consultation on default flexible working sounds like progress, in reality, I think it's going to bring very little useful change. And it's really missing a great opportunity to get employers to change when it's never been more clearly in their interests to do so. But I think the good news for any organisation working with PiPA is that we have got the resources and the insights and the networks to help you get on the front foot with flexible working and to compete successfully well before day one of somebody's employment, so that you're able to attract and retain the talent that you need. So I will stop there. If anyone's got any immediate questions, you can stick them in the Q&A quickly, but otherwise there will be plenty of time to pick up questions later. We're going to have a full Q&A towards the end. So I'm just seeing if there are any. There's nothing coming up through the Q&A. So shall we just move on? I think I want to hand over for some practical real life experience from my fellow trustee Debra Sawyer from Mercury Theatre and also Caroline McCall from CETA. So I will hand over to Debra and Caroline.
Hi, shall I go first, Caroline?
Yeah, that sounds good. That's fine. Yeah.
For Mercury, we've just reopened our venue after 2 years of a refurbishment, which has meant that we've been doing an interesting model anyway, because we've not been on site, we've been in a separate office. So pre-pandemic, there were 37 full-time staff as opposed to 74, between 74 and 122. because we didn't have a building to be working in. And only a very few of us, mainly senior managers, had the opportunity to work remotely on odd days, except for me. And it was written into my contract very early on that I worked 2 days a week in the office and 3 days a week at home. No, I worked 3 days in the office and 2 days a week at home. That was what it was. And it worked well. But because we were out of our building anyway, we already were well on the way to having the ability to work remotely. It's just that it wasn't the thing that we did, apart from me. And so pandemic hit, and we were able within 24 hours to have everybody set up at home, because the technology we used in office enabled us to just take that out, kept the server going in the office, and everybody could work at home. And that became tricksy, particularly around where production staff obviously weren't able to do anything because there were no shows, and front of house staff were still able to answer phones and answer queries. So we went into a rolling program of furlough and people working from home. But now we're back in the building. After much discussion, we've decided to move to what I think Sarah described as a hybrid way of working. So there were managers who very early on didn't like the idea that people wouldn't then all automatically come back to the office on day one. But through a lot of talking and a lot of consultation with the staff team, we've agreed to go for a hybrid way of working. So that some days people are in office and some days people are at home. And so for me, my working days have flipped. So I'm now 2 days in the office and 3 days working at home. And for many staff, it's a mixture of whatever suits the staff. We found that works. We all also found that it was really important to have a line on our email footers that said, I'm sending this potentially out of office hours, out of your office hours, but I don't expect you to respond until you are in your office hours. And that's particularly been useful for those members of staff who have children or caring responsibilities, because it meant that you could move your hours wherever you need them. So bedtime, you stop working. After school pick up, bedtime, you stop working. But my team know I might be sending them an email at 9 o'clock, but I don't expect them to work and answer it at 9 o'clock unless it says urgent, but then I phone them anyway. While we have been doing remote working, we have been looking at a number of ways to keep in touch with the team. Because over the pandemic, everybody found it really difficult and quite isolating. However, we instituted a series of ways that we keep in touch. So we had what we started with virtual Friday night drinks. So everybody could drink whatever they were drinking at 5 o'clock on Friday, and we'd have a Zoom call. And then we moved to a daytime tea break, where the idea is not to discuss work. The idea was to discuss a social element, but that was particularly pandemic related. Now we have gone to a hybrid staff meeting. So whoever's in the office on the day of the staff meeting meets in a room with everybody else, but we also have teams set up in the room so that everybody who's not in the building can still join the discussion. So we have really worked out an interesting way of doing it, but we haven't answered all those questions yet. We're still working on how do we ensure that communication that Sarah talks about was so important. There are a number of our staff who have chosen to come back to the office 5 days a week. But we gave everybody the choice through a one-to-one meeting with each of the staff members when we were allowed to come back to the office. We asked, what is your working pattern? What would you like it to be? And then the HOD for that department was responsible for crafting almost a rota so that there was presence in the office at all times on each of our open working days. So we have been able to do that, and there isn't anybody. We've said that we insist on seeing everybody at least once during the week, just so we can check in with them. And people seem to like that. They don't, nobody in our organisation at the moment wants to be completely remote. So that's working well for us at the moment. But there are some things that we have learnt, and some things that we do now that we didn't do before, even throughout the pandemic. But while we're now working in this hybrid model, we're acknowledging people's caring responsibilities more as an organisation. So people understand that during maybe school pickup time, that's not a good time, or school drop-off time. So we flexed our meetings, so no meeting starts before 10 o'clock. So we've been able to make that learning an actual way of working throughout. We've also been better at ensuring appropriate touch points. It's made all of us as managers really value those one-to-one check-ins, and whether that one-to-one is in person or whether it's on Teams or on Zoom, we're now much more robust in booking those one-to-ones, carrying them out on a regular basis, and note-taking from them so that we have agreed actions. But we've also learned just to be more flexible. We've learned that some people just do not get on with the idea of remote working, don't feel that they can motivate themselves in the same way without having their colleagues beside them. But some of us actually really value that time of, I can sit down, get that done, and then get back to my phone calls, or then get back to the conversations I need to have. So that's, flexibility is the most important thing we've learned. I'm going to hand over to Caroline.
Hello, thank you so much. That's so interesting to hear, actually. A little bit about me. My name is Caroline. I work as a wardrobe supervisor as well as a costume supervisor. Both very different roles. I have a fantastic role on a West End show where I do a job share, which is wonderful. But during the pandemic, when that hit, wardrobe supervising, that was all on furlough. That was something that could not be created in a flexible working environment. So we couldn't be doing live shows. So that work I was on furlough for. My other work, the costume supervising work, that was something that was really interesting, because I do feel like there are aspects of that which we've learned through the pandemic that can be created for flexible working, working from home, remote working, which was really exciting, actually. I think a lot of the costume industry, we're so used to having to be physically in a building, working with our colleagues. So during the pandemic, I had a huge opera that I was working on as a costume supervisor, and we did all of it remotely. And the way we were able to do that was quite interesting, was because normally we'd be fabric shopping. Instead, we were obviously calling companies, we were requesting fabric samples to be sent to us. Usually we'd be meeting, we'd be discussing it. There was a little bit more work involved in having to post samples of fabrics to each other to discuss it. We did all of our meetings remotely, which was fantastic for me. I'm also a mum and I've got 2 small children. So similar to what Debra was saying, something like flexible working was really helpful for me. I had 2 small children. I could be doing a lot of this work where I was putting together the Bible and the prep work and the costume Bible, which I'm sure a lot of you know is kind of a lot of the information to get that show together. So I was able to work my hours around the children, looking after them, doing things late in the evening, doing things early, doing things at the weekend. And then we would be touching base on a regular, Zoom meeting as we needed to talk about everything that was put together. I feel like the costume Bible is something that definitely is quite easily able to be done from home, but possibly just hasn't been set up for that previously. Normally we'd be in a theatre, we'd be in a building, we'd be doing that in hours. You'd have to organise childcare. So having the flexibility of doing that, creating the paperwork for the show and not having to do it in a physical building was really helpful for me. So that was kind of like how we managed it, and it worked really well for us for the show. We were able to send, the designer was doing designs, we were sending fabric swatches, we were putting together detailed written descriptions of what these costumes were, how they were made, and we were doing that all over the internet. And then that information was all being sent to the house that was making them. They ordered the fabrics, they created the costumes, and then after the pandemic and things opened up, we went and we saw fittings. And it was amazing to see that actually a little bit more work was needed in order to write very clear descriptions as to what was needed, rather than checking in with those people in person. But it was very possible to generate all of that information and then just arrive at a fitting and then kind of coordinate the last details of it. So yeah, that's kind of how we put the show together remotely. I don't know if I need to hand over to somebody else.
That's brilliant, Caroline and Deborah. Thank you so much for that. Those really, both of those examples really highlight the potential benefits and also some of the challenges that still need to be worked through. So thank you so much for sort of breathing life into everything that has been said by Anna and by Sarah so far. And now what I'm going to look at is just some of the practicalities of putting those ways of remote working actually into practice. So just bear with me while I share my screen, and then we will go through those points. Brilliant. So as I said, I'll now take you through our practical recommendations for strengthening the benefits and addressing those challenges of remote working. So if remote working is going to become this long-term embedded working practice, it needs to work for both your organisation and individual members of your workforce. You will have been at different levels of readiness for remote working pre-lockdown, and since then, lessons have been learned, strategies have developed, and individual circumstances have changed. So through thorough planning, this is how remote working can now be embedded, and all of those lessons learned can help to push your organisation forward. So to do that, we have 5 steps that we recommend, and I will go through these. So through necessity and survival, many organisations have adopted remote working on a scale they never had considered before, and many roles have found flexibility where before it may not have been seen. It is important not to lose this innovation, and rather than returning to normal, we really have an opportunity to redefine what normal can be. This will involve evaluating the successes and the challenges from the last 20 months in an attempt to detach the experience from COVID so that you can really harness the benefits of remote working. So, for example, as Anna mentioned earlier, we know a challenge over the past 20 months has been homeschooling whilst remote working. However, going forward, the sudden closure of schools should become less of an impact on your effectiveness for remote working. So being able to evaluate that moment and detach it will help you to have a real clear picture of what remote working can actually be. But we're also really aware of successes that have been found. So from model box presentations and company read-throughs that have happened remotely, in a post-COVID world, this practice can reduce travel and childcare costs. So this is a real bonus going forward. So this evaluation phase will enable you to identify those different opportunities. Linked to the evaluation is the consultation of your workforce, which we've heard quite a bit about already of the really consulting what your workforce need and where they are. Finding out their experiences, requests and challenges will give you real insight to inform how you move forward with remote working. Across our charter programme, we have heard from a number of senior leaders who have said, oh, I think our team will or won't keep remote working because of X, Y and Z. And then they've been really surprised by what the actual feeling is on the ground once they've consulted. Our research shows a real appetite for this blended approach to remote working. There are times that individuals really want to stay together in person, but there are tasks or times in the week where remote working would be beneficial to both productivity and to work-life balance. Also, it is important to use this time to understand who your new workforce is. We've lived through a pandemic, so the people returning to your organisation will have changed somehow since March 2020. From our COVID research, we know care and responsibilities have increased, particularly for women and those with disabilities. Financial positions have changed, meaning some of your workforce may have had to move further away from your building, or they've reduced their transportation to save costs, so they don't have the same capacity to commute. Due to COVID or not, disabilities, illnesses and conditions may have changed too, and remote working could become a key tool in retaining those individuals. So we would recommend conducting a staff survey to inquire into all of this. For example, one of our charter partners found from doing this that a member of their backstage department who had their hours reduced to 4 days a week during the pandemic, on being offered to go back to full-time hours, asked if they could, but could they keep to 4 days in the building and 1 day at home, as this would help her to make appointments for her mum, who she'd become the primary carer for during lockdown. Without the consultation and this evaluation of the past year, this opportunity might not have presented itself. The next, and again, something that has come across through everything that everyone said so far, is strong communication. And a strong and clear remote working policy is the start of that communication, informing your workforce of what it is, how it can be accessed, expectations of your team, and how all of this will be managed. There is a sample policy within the toolkit, so I would recommend looking at that. Further considerations around communication will occur when preparing for the practicalities of remote working. How will team meetings and one-to-ones take place? How will team working and meetings be scheduled? Are there set times or dates, or as Debra said, maybe times to avoid? Is there a way to facilitate those water cooler moments? Will you use different platforms for different reasons or for different meetings? These are all important decisions, and a number of these can be made by team members. The responsibility for all decisions within remote working does not just need to land with a manager. How remote working looks in a technical department is going to be different to how it looks in a finance department. So it's important that individual teams can assess their roles and unpack their ways of working to understand how this will work for them. And I know this team and department focused approach is something that Kate from the RSC will pick up a little bit later on. 1 second. Thank you. The next recommendation is to create an inventory. So making sure anyone who is working remotely has appropriate devices, software and broadband that is fit for purpose and suitable for their remote working, and that they also have suitable remote work space. That is key to the success of its implementation. The list on the slide is not exhaustive and mainly considers office and desk-based duties. We are aware of that. So different conversations will need to take place in order to facilitate remote working for other roles. So will a person working remotely in wardrobe, for example, need a courier or travel support for costumes? Do they have sufficient storage for materials? Do they have the correct sewing equipment? The same responsibilities within an organisation's workspace assessment should still apply to remote working. That's something really useful to think about in terms of how you set your organisation up for remote working. So on page 8 of our toolkit that we've created, there is a resource checklist to support you with the logistics of this. And our final recommendation in this planning process is a trial period. Any new form of remote or flexible working will benefit from a set trial period, as it needs to work for both the individual and the organisation. Trials and regular reviews will support everyone to adjust to this new working practice. The success of embedding any degree of remote working will depend on both the individual and the organisation taking equal responsibility in its implementation. So we've recently supported one of our charter partners to find this increased flexibility with 2 of their senior technicians. This is new for the company, completely new. They acknowledge that lessons will be learned, and as more productions open up in their venue, even further lessons will be learned. But they have put parameters in place to make it happen for now, with a 3-month trial and then a set date to review how that 3-month trial has gone and what they want to do as their next steps. We would not expect any organisation to have all the answers, and this is why trials are important, and it's also how expectations can be managed whilst finding the right solution. So those are our 5 steps for planning for remote working as a whole. But we also know that within the performing arts, there are particular roles and departments where remote working is not as straightforward. It's important to consider how these roles still have equitable access to flexible working requests, and that there is a transparent process for assessing these roles. So as Caroline said earlier, there are aspects of her job that she needs to be with other people for, needs to be in a building for, but by unpacking the duties within her role, there are clear areas for flexibility and for remote working. So I'd just like to go over those. There is a step-by-step tool for managers from page 6 of our toolkit, which can be used in conversation with employees when attempting to identify where the flexibility is within a role and workload, and where remote and a mixed model of remote working could come into play. The 4 areas are role, collaboration, time, and location. So role is all about understanding the key aspects. What are the role's essential duties, their deadlines, their deliverables, and how could they be managed and delivered remotely? So for example, DSM, they can be in the studio for rehearsals, but rehearsal reports could be circulated from offsite. Collaboration, this contextualizes the role in terms of the team it is within, who they report to, and who they manage, and again, how this could be affected or improved by remote working. So a director would ideally be in the building for rehearsals, but the collaboration needed for a production meeting could happen over Zoom. And then finally, we have time and location, which speak to one another. So looking into contracted hours can help explore flexibility through shift patterns or moving core hours, or even if tasks can be shared between 2 people to facilitate that split and allow remote working. And location picks up on something that Sarah spoke about earlier, just really identifying the nuts and bolts, which tasks need to be carried out on site and which do not. And when you identify the do not, that also opens up the capacity of the role in terms of where remote working can happen. So those are our 4 points, but again, there's a much bigger description and tools within the toolkit. As we've mentioned throughout, all of this learning has been captured in that very toolkit, which we were able to create by working with and learning from the different practices and trials that were occurring within our charter programme and from our charter partners. One of those is the Royal Shakespeare Company, And that's why I'm delighted to now hand over to Kate Sirdefield from the RSC to talk us through what those steps that I've covered look like in practice and the learning that they've encountered as an organisation when undergoing a process like this. So I will hand over to Kate.
Thanks, Matt. So hi, everyone. I'm Kate Sirdefield and I'm head of HR at the RSC as of last month. I have worked in HR for nearly 20 years now. I've been at the RSC since January 2018. I originally joined as an HR manager. We're lucky enough with the size of organisation that we support an in-house HR team, and we've been working on our approach to flexibility for a number of years already. So it's great that PiPA have set up this webinar with SOLT UK Theatre. We're really proud to be a PiPA Charter partner, and their support has been invaluable as we've worked through this really significant period of change. So don't have long to talk. So as Matt said, I'm going to really focus on our practical experience of what we've done so far. It's by no means finished, and what we've learned along the way. So I don't claim at all to have all the answers, but I'm really happy to share our experiences so far and what we've found. I do appreciate there'll be lots of different backgrounds, experiences and organisations on today's webinar. So our context is that we have around 700 permanent staff. That varies, obviously. Plus we have our freelancer colleagues and we have a huge variety of departments. But I do hope that some of our experiences will resonate with you, even if your context is really different to ours, because people are people wherever they are and however they work. So as I said, we've been talking about flexible working for as long as I've been at the RSC. We had begun to explore different ways to broaden our approach to flexibility. We did already offer quite a lot of flexibility across different sites, working patterns, hours, etc. But we knew from previous work that we'd done, including a research project that Tonic Theatre did with us in 2019, that our teams were looking for more. We had begun to work through those plans. We'd made the connection with this work and our focus on well-being, but we really hadn't made a breakthrough. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So like many others, we were thrown into a world where our priorities changed and we had to figure out quickly, how can we continue to operate in this new environment? The majority of our teams were furloughed at some point, many people for a long time, over a year in some cases. And in fact, the beginning of this month is the first time that we haven't had anyone furloughed since March 2020. As a result of that, we had a really difficult period last year, as well as many organisations will have done, where we had to collectively consult with our workforce to restructure. Sadly, that meant we lost around 12% of our employed teams, and we had a further 15% working reduced hours, and in fact, some of them still are. As we began to gradually increase our activity, we had teams returning to work on site, others stayed working remotely, and really we started to think about what does the world now look like? How do we want it to be at the RSC, and how do we need to work differently as a result? So what did we do? Well, initially, we recognised from the outset that this is a cultural change piece as much, if not more so, than a practical response to the pandemic. So we've taken a really carefully staged approach as we've gone through. So as Matt had said, the first thing we found really helpful was to do a big piece of internal research. So we issued a survey to our staff and our freelancers earlier this year. It was a survey focusing on well-being, but part of that was around how people felt about flexible working. We had nearly 180 responses, and our findings were very much in line with the results of the survey that PiPA had done earlier this year. So 2/3 of our people that responded said that their mental health had got worse. When we asked what support we could offer that would help with that, one of the most popular responses was more flexibility. We knew that 1/3 of our teams have caring responsibilities. Nearly 90% of those said that those had increased over the course of the pandemic. Unsurprisingly, nobody's caring responsibilities had decreased, so we knew that this was an increased focus for our teams. 2/3 of people told us they wanted more flexibility with where they work, and that rose to nearly 90% of people who had worked throughout the pandemic. So the longer that people had worked remotely, the more people wanted to keep doing it. But even amongst our staff who'd been furloughed throughout, in roles that you might not typically consider to be flexible, nearly half of those said they also wanted more flexibility. And we found that nearly half of people said actually what they really wanted was a split of this remote home hybrid model. In the comments, they were really interesting. People told us, we just want flexibility to be seen as the norm. It should just be the way that we do things, particularly fitting working hours around other commitments, such as the school run. And they told us that the support of their line manager and the organisation was absolutely critical to making this work. So it was great to hear that there was a real appetite for focusing on increased flexibility, but we realised really quickly that it would be impossible to create a one-size-fits-all. We're just too diverse in the number of roles, the types of roles, the locations, the skills, but we wanted to ensure that our approach was as equitable as possible across the organisation. So we decided to create a set of organisational principles which acted as a framework. However, within that, we devolved the decisions about how to implement it down to heads of department, local managers working closely with their teams, because they of course know what their teams do, what they need, much better than anybody else does. And that was a really big shift for us. Those principles were signed off by our senior leadership team, and they'd been involved in the discussions throughout. And we definitely found that that level of sponsorship and engagement was really important to making it work. Some of the key principles that we have adopted are to really approach flexible working with a positive mindset. So we want to look for ways to make it work wherever possible. We want to enable colleagues to work in a way that suits them best, but of course that has to be carefully balanced with the requirements of the role. And we know that different types of flexibility are possible and not possible in different roles. So, for example, some teams' work means, of course, they need to be on site at all times, but they might be able to work part-time, or they might be able to job share or have flexible shifts. So it's about being specific about what's possible. We also want to encourage informal flexibility wherever possible. So of course, the formal request mechanism is still there, but really we want that to be used for contractual changes or where we haven't been able to work it through informally first. We've also started work planning, laying out our workspaces differently that will enable hybrid working. So having more flexible workspaces, more hot desks, more breakout spaces, for example. And we've accepted that we aren't going to get everything right first time and that we can't wait for it to be perfect. So we will implement what we can, we monitor it, we review what's working, and then we change it quickly if we need to. So once we'd agreed those principles, we engaged the department heads and managers in the plans. So we created our own local toolkit to really help them through this, thinking through the specific needs of their team. Unfortunately for us, it was before the PiPA toolkit came out, which is absolutely brilliant, but it was along very similar lines. So we invited all of our heads of department to come to a briefing and an engagement session to talk it all through in detail, understand what their concerns might be, give them the opportunity to ask any questions. They then went and engaged their teams in that locally, and they worked with their teams on what their local arrangements were going to be. So this comes back to what Matt was just talking about. They looked at the roles, what's the work, are there any requirements about when or where specific work needs to be done? Are there other departments internally or external partners who we need to collaborate closely with on our working practices? And we found that by diagnosing and deciding what was essential, we could then also be really clear about what was flexible. Department heads alongside that, they also spoke to individuals to understand more about their specific needs. So be that access requirements, caring commitments, or any other individual context, so that they could feed that into their local departmental planning. So teams developed their own local plans for how they'd work differently, and it was over them to implement it locally. We are very much in trial phase at the moment. Our office is actually only reopened in Stratford at the start of this month. We still have lots of COVID measures in place, so it could not by any means be described as normal at the moment. We obviously have teams who are back fully on site. We still have a lot of meetings taking place virtually, and many teams have decided that's what they want to continue doing. Some teams have already started to refine what they thought their plans were going to be based on what's working in practice. We've got lots more to do. So we really focused on employed roles initially. We haven't yet worked this way through a full production cycle. Some departments are still working on setting up their plans. Some have yet to start. So we've really got different people in different phases across the organisation at the moment. So what have we learned so far? Well, it's absolutely critical to ask people what they want and involve them in the way forward. I think it was Matt, or forgive me, I can't remember who it was, said earlier, actually might be surprised by what people say that they want, and that may have changed over the course of the pandemic. So that's really important. We've also found it's really critical to spend time engaging with stakeholders, particularly managers. the senior management support has been really important to us, but so has involving teams in setting their local plans. We have learned that more jobs have elements which can be done flexibly and remotely than we thought possible. For example, our box office team have been fully remote throughout the pandemic, and indeed they still are. We found it's important to get the right people in the conversation. So obviously this depends on the size of the organisation, but we have made sure that we've had involvement from our IT department and our facilities team, for example, from the outset. We found it's really important to be clear about your expectations and what is and isn't possible. People have responded really, really well to the clarity of understanding what the parameters are within their role and within their team. It's absolutely critical to just test and learn as you go. It's okay if it doesn't work as expected, keep refining it. It's an iterative process, and sometimes you don't learn until you're in that situation. So we're keeping on reviewing it. And we're not going from a standing start. I think Anna said this at the beginning. Actually, lots of our teams and our people already worked flexibly within the organisation, and they can help us learn from their experiences previously. We found it really helps to plan regular contact time. So a number of people have referred to this already, but particularly when teams are rarely, if ever, all in the same place at the same time, being really deliberate about when you're going to talk to people, what that's about, and planning in that social contact time can be really beneficial. So we in the HR team for a long time have had a 15-minute cup of tea, start the day, social conversation a couple of days a week, and that's been really helpful. We also know that we just want to trust people to know the best ways to do their job. At this point in the pandemic, people have refined their ways of working, and they know how to be really productive away from the office or their usual workspace. They also know what types of work are better done remotely and in person with other people. And it was really good to hear some discussion earlier about the impact on recruitment. We know that some people that have joined the organisation recently have told us they are only now working with us because of our approach to flexibility and our remote working policy, and that if we hadn't introduced these new ways of working, they would not have been able to join the organisation. So it's absolutely broadened the new candidates that we're attracting to come and work with us. So what's next? As I said, we're continuing to trial and review. We're doing that through local departments, but we've also recently set up an inbox, which is specifically where people can email queries and suggestions through. And we have a small team of cross-departmental representatives who meet every week to review what comes into the inbox and also what's working and what isn't. We know there's tons of great external content about this through podcasts, webinars, articles. Lots of people are going through this at the moment. Lots of people are learning what works and what doesn't. So we're working on curating those and setting up a learning resource centre online for our teams and our managers. We've just launched a manager networking group as well, which is a really informal community of managers who meet regularly, virtually, to share insights and learn from each other on a variety of common interests, such as how they're implementing working differently. And we continue to review our recruitment practices so that we are starting the conversation with candidates about their flexible working needs and requirements, so that they feel comfortable discussing that with us throughout the recruitment process. So I think to close, it's absolutely fair to say that I think, like many others, we wouldn't have been able to make such a huge change without the complete paradigm shift of the pandemic. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and someone described this whole topic as like climbing a mountain, and said, actually, we're all still in the foothills of this at the moment. We're still adjusting, we're still learning. We've had to learn how to be fully remote, and now we're having to learn how to be hybrid, and that's a different approach. But ultimately, we are a creative industry, so we can find creative solutions. And that is what I hope that we're trying to do. I do think, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, the toolkit that PiPA has developed is absolutely fantastic. I wish we'd had it when we were going through what we were doing earlier this year. It would have absolutely helped. I think it's a brilliant resource. So I would really encourage people to look at what they've put together and see what works for you and for your organisation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and that was very nice of you to say as well. Just to say, we're not paying Kate to advertise this, so brilliant. Thank you. This was I think this was really exciting, because what we saw here is the journey an organization is going through, as well as what Debra was saying as well, that sort of journey of taking your staff along and really seeing how far you can spread and trialing opportunities and then giving yourself the time to adjust. We've actually come to the point of the Q&A, so I would love of all of our panel and speakers to turn the cameras back on, so I'm not talking to myself, so that we can actually talk to each other. And also, obviously, now is the time to fire away your questions. I know Matt has got already some burning questions, but for everybody else, it would be fantastic if you put your questions in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. It can be anonymous if you want to be anonymous or not, and then we can ask them directly to our wonderful panel here. But Matt, I'll hand you the first question.
Yes, just while we're giving the Q&A some time just to the questions to roll in, what's been really interesting is just the sort of the gravity of learning within this Zoom. And some people might be sat there thinking, oh, what's just a little thing that I can just take away and maybe start with that. And that it came into my head, Debra, when you were saying about the really practical solution of saying about remote working and flexible working in the email. So just a really simple, clear way of communicating. I feel like that is potentially something that everybody can go, do you know what? I'm going to take that away and we're going to try that in my next email. So I'd just be really interested if they're to hear from anybody of just those sort of little golden nuggets of a practical tip that you might say, maybe try this. What would that be for any of you? And Debra, if you have any more from the Mercury, please bring those in as well.
Yes, the email footer was, it's been a great idea, and I think it's really reassured staff that their time is not being completely overridden by working from home. But I think for me, the real thing was stressing to people, we will be flexible with the hours. You know, if you get up and you want to start work at 8, then you finish at 4, or you take a break in the middle of the day because you want to go and do your shopping while it's quiet. That's all good. Just make sure it's in your diary that everybody can access.
So use of diaries to communicate that flexibility. I echo that. Me and Anna live by our calendars in terms of communicating our flexibility to one another, but also that real clear communication of what like adjusting core hours might mean. You know, it might feel to some people quite a conceptual thing or quite a big thing of how do I shift my core hours, but just simple but clear communication like that of this is how you can do it and this is how it's communicated to the team.
Can I jump in, Matt? I think one of the things that we found is using shared documents has been incredibly helpful. So where you're perhaps going to be working on things at a different time from somebody else, rather than get caught up in a big email chain that you then have to catch up with when you're back, is you've got one shared document that people can log in and work on when they're working, and it becomes quite a dynamic approach. So, you know, that's been something that's been invaluable to us.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's something that we PiPA works entirely remotely, and we've got staff all over the UK, and this is something that obviously we use a lot as well. And what we also find very useful is we all have a platform. We specifically use Teams, and there is this sort of informal chat happening as well, where you just go, oh, could you quickly have a look at this, or do you mind sharing that document, or I can't find something. Which is very useful, because that's normally what happens in an office environment, where you normally sit next to each other and say, like, by the way, I meant to ask you something. Plus having the occasional personal exchange as well of like, oh, how's your dog, or did your husband get the job, or whatever else it is. So it's a tool to kind of bring people together. We've got some questions in the chat I'd like to bring together, and actually now, you know, since we had a bit of a hiccup of Zoom in the beginning anyway, that is really interesting about the hybrid teams and hybrid meetings. So the question goes specifically to Debra and Kate, how their organizations might manage if it happens to you. If you have a meeting which is half of the people are actually in the room and half of the people join via a virtual platform, be it Zoom or Teams or Google Hangouts. How do you manage that, and how satisfying do you think the participants might have found that?
We do it all the time. We do a lot of it. With meetings, it's taught us all a new etiquette, because in our big meeting rooms we have a large screen on one end, so we've had to learn that we've got to address the room but then also address the screen depending on where you're sitting. We find it fine. We've been doing quite a lot of interviewing. I'm sure Kate's doing a lot of recruitment at the moment. We interview usually first interviews on Zoom or on Teams, but second interview we do like to be in the same room. So that's the only time when I said that complete remote working is difficult, because there is something about being in a room for an interview. But general meetings, I don't know about Kate, but we find it completely satisfactory. It's fine.
I think it's fair to say we're struggling a little bit with this one at the moment. Actually, it's quite interesting. So we're only really 4 weeks into having the offices reopened. We've definitely learned that for bigger meetings, having everybody virtual still feels like it's the best way to be. We've got offices in London, and I know some of our London teams have said actually they've really seen through the pandemic it's been quite a leveler for them, because previously they were usually the ones dialing in and everybody else was in a room, and actually they've loved the fact that it's kind of they're equally around the virtual table, if you like. We don't probably have in all of our meetings room yet the technology that you maybe have, Debra. So we've only got one meeting room, or one or two meeting rooms that have got that technology set up. So we're looking at doing that more. So at the moment, what you'll find is it's maybe a couple of people, trying to fit around a screen whilst also following our social distancing arrangements that we have in place. It's been quite challenging. That is something that we are trying to work on, but we've probably had the most feedback that people are finding that quite difficult. So we'll watch this space.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a couple of, because our building's just been refurbished, we do have some really good technology. But what we've also done is we flipped our somebody's laptop up to a projector and projected onto a wall, so we've got more space, and then used a webcam. So depending on how many people are in the meeting, we've used like the rehearsal room, or we've used a meeting room. But yeah, so far it seems to be all right.
Can I chip in on this and just say I think it's something to be careful about and really think about inclusion and participation. I know that before the pandemic, a lot of organisations, when they were thinking about what we didn't call hybrid working at the time, would have a rule that either meetings were all in person or all remote. And I know that, and that was very much about participation. And I would say that if it's panning out as it is, Debra, with you, that people seem to be quite happy to be doing hybrid meetings where some people are dialing in and some people are around the table. I would just be keeping my eye on that and making sure that you don't have a situation where it's the same people who are always dialing in. So that you really, I don't think you should be afraid to say there are certain times in the week or the month where we need everybody on site, so that you do keep the team cohesion. And I also know that because of the fact that it can be, if your technology is not quite right, it can be quite excluding to be the person who's dialing in, especially if in the minority. A lot of organisations will say if one person dials in, we all dial in. So even somebody who's in the office on the premises will go to their desk and use their screen. So for example, the Royal Ballet does that. I know that they will have a meeting where 3 people will be on the premises and they'll all sit at their desks, and the 4th person who's dialing in from wherever. So you get that absolute sort of equality of access to participation. So I'd just say you work it out as you go along and see what works. But if you are going down the hybrid meeting route, just track it in terms of inclusion and participation.
I just wondered, Caroline, did you have an experience where you were sort of called in remotely to where people were actually in the office?
We have done, sorry, my throat. We've done a little bit during the pandemic. We were all remotely. So whilst I was working on the project, we were all Zooming in. Then there's been kind of like, since the pandemic has opened things up, there's been a little bit of both. So kind of like the other ladies were talking about, sometimes you'd be in meetings, some people would be remotely Zooming in, especially when we're having production meetings, which I think is wonderful, because sometimes, like as a costume person, you are not necessarily based in the theatre room where they're making the work. So having that opportunity to possibly be somewhere else and not having to spend an hour traveling to get to that rehearsal room for a production meeting was really helpful. So sometimes we'd be in the space, we'd be doing fittings, we'd be physically there, we'd be Zooming. Sometimes we'd be out shopping, we'd be doing other things, and we could Zoom in. And I think other departments were doing the same thing. So it was optional, and it was helpful and much more productive of a lot of our time as well.
Yeah, I see that. Obviously, one of the participants also pointed out, we were saying about, everybody joining in online, even if you're in the office. If you're in a very small office, this could obviously bring some noise issues, especially in these shared spaces, if some people are actually not in the meeting or not. So, it is a bit, I suppose it's all a bit dependent on how your personal setup of your organization is. Which is, I think, a theme that will run through this. There's another question here which I find really interesting and would be good to hear from those of you who manage, is the benefits of allowing flexible or remote working informally first before the formal flexible working request. What are your feelings around that? Do you think that that's the sort of way to go, or should a flexible working request be made first and then take it from there?
So we find that, the more you can do to encourage managers and their teams to be in constant dialogue is just the best thing. It's the most productive. It's the best for engagement. So we would always encourage people to have those conversations first. I think there's some quite practical elements to it as well, that the formal flexible working process is quite structured. And that it possibly introduces a formality that just doesn't need to be there. I'm sure you can imagine, with the number of people that we employ, we did have a significant number of formal requests. And what we want to do, and interestingly, we are planning on making the right to request a day one right. We're planning on removing the restrictions around how many times people can put in a request, because we just want it to be more of a fluid, dynamic process.
Yeah. Debra, similar to you, or?
I'm sitting here racking my brains thinking we actually haven't got it formally, apart from my contract. I don't think it's formally in anybody's contract. It's just something that's we've rolled into. We've had conversations about it, but I've not followed up in paper, and that's probably a bad thing. Or is it? I don't know. We are just sucking and seeing, to be honest.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm sure Sarah can say something about that. But what we have found over the time is it's a great way to start with the informal, to trial and to find your feet. But what is dangerous is if a flexible working arrangement is dependent on your relationship with your manager. If that manager leaves, where does that leave you, and how does that become fair across everybody if it's literally sort of based on, oh, I know them well and she knows my relationship. So I wonder, Sarah, where is there the point where you go, actually this should be made more formal?
If it's going to be a contractual change, it should be formal. So if it's going to affect somebody's pay, then clearly it's formal. And the other time you'll want it formal, or the person will want it to be formal, is if they are absolutely dependent on being able to walk out the door at a certain time. So what you will find is that parents and carers, and particularly women, are more likely to have contractual flexible arrangements than anybody else, because it's usually around care responsibilities. And that's where you absolutely need the protection of knowing that if my manager changes, who I've got a good relationship with, my flexible working arrangement will not change. So I think there are, you know, I'm absolutely with Kate. I think the more you can do to make it just a fluid, dynamic process so that within teams, and this is because it is a cultural change, it's about getting to a point where the manager or the leader of every team is working with their group of team members, and they're looking together at how they manage when, where, and how long people are working. But there will nevertheless be certain points where somebody actually comes and says, I need to work part-time because, or I need to work on this pattern because. And at that point, it's always a good idea to agree a trial period first, if you can do so. Sometimes people are so anxious they don't want one, but it's always a good idea to have a trial period, because that way, again, the staff member may discover it's not quite what they want, or the manager may need to have to come to them and say, actually, this doesn't work because. So it's just using it, keeping it in its place as a useful tool and a protection when it's needed.
I think maybe adding on to that in sort of lieu of contractual changes, even still getting something down on paper in a different format, as Anna said. So if someone moves departments or gets a new manager, you know, something that came to my head was the carer's passport, which is just a document which captures, this is who I am, this is what I need, and this is what's been put in place for me. And it's not a contractual change, but there is a documentation, which means that if someone does go to another department, the process doesn't have to start again. There's a way of going, this is how I've worked within this department, and this is how I need to continue to work to be in order to do my best. So I'd still say that some way of documenting it, or just so there's a trail of it somewhere, is also useful as well.
Yeah, I spotted an interesting question here, which may be quite good to put in that point as well. So this panel here is of course very much for remote working and very supportive, but has anybody come across about dealing with a manager who maybe is not so keen about enabling remote working and actually want everybody to come back? How would you approach that? I was just thinking about this trial period, maybe a good way of you know, maybe encouraging somebody who is hesitant to enable remote working. Have you come across that in your organizations, and how have you dealt with it?
I think I think people's mindset has shifted hugely, I would say, first of all, in the last 15 months. We've kind of come at it from two angles. We've wanted to put this organisational framework in place so that we can say, you know, the culture across the RSC is that we want to approach flexible working positively. So that is our sort of default ethos. What we then did was really engage in those conversations with managers. So by talking to managers about it on a one-to-one, what that change meant, what that meant within their departments, giving them the autonomy to really deconstruct the work they do, really helps people think through their assumptions about what can and can't be done flexibly. So I think it's about engaging, and not engaging as a one-off. It's kind of constantly engaging and talking to people about what that really means, but giving managers the autonomy to really explore what that means locally for them, we have found really, really helpful, because it's giving control and decision making really where it should sit, which is people who understand their department and what they do, rather than us imposing something.
I completely echo what Kate has just said. I have had that situation, and it's taken a lot of talking to the manager to understand what their reservations are about remote working or flexible working, and outlining where could be the benefits, and then suggesting a trial period of give it a try. If it's really not working for how you manage and how your team wants to be managed, then we'll revisit it.
Yes, very good. I think Matt, did you?
I was just going to say, I really like the idea of we'll revisit it, not and then we'll stop it. It's a we'll revisit it, and it might be that actually the way of working, the new way of working would work, but it might be that the manager actually needs more support or more it's not the individual that's having the remote working request that needs to change. Actually, it's the manager that just needs a little bit more support in terms of how they manage, or they need to become a little bit more skilled in using digital platforms, or, you know, I really like that idea of it'll be revisited, not we'll put a stop to the trial.
Can I just say, oh, sorry,
Caroline, you go first.
I was just going to say, as a freelancer, it's interesting, and I love that organizations are so supportive of this. I think as a freelancer, it's you coming at it a little bit differently. I think those of us that jump from job to job, the structure isn't always there, or the support isn't always there, or you don't necessarily know all the people so well. Like, I've definitely felt more confident as I go on with my career, and I've had children, with organizations or producers that I know, to ask for more flexible working. And I think there's a lot of people in the theatre industry who are not working full time for an organization. They're just coming in, they're doing a job, it's temporary. There is an anxiety in kind of speaking up, or being that person to say, actually, can you change the parameters of this job to make it work for me in this situation? Just to, I think we all know that, but just to kind of like, just to say that and put that out there, that I think it's wonderful that the organizations are leading the way for this, because I think that's where it needs to start, for then freelancers individually to then have the confidence to kind of speak up as well, and it ripple through.
I just wanted to go back to managers briefly, just to say that two of the things I really like from what Kate was describing are things that I've seen work very well in other organisations. That if you are trying to carry or support sceptical or anxious managers, the first is to start with those organisational principles. So there's a very clear statement that this organisation, you know, supports flexible working because. So at senior leadership level, it's there. And then the other thing is this wonderful idea of having a manager forum or a network, so managers can support each other and they can say the unsayable to each other. You know, if you set things up so that managers are meeting for coffee on a weekly basis, that's where a manager can say to their peers, I really hate this, I'm really worried about, I am whatever, and get support from people who are also doing it. So two brilliant ideas there I would say to take away from what the RSC is doing.
Absolutely. I find it really interesting, Caroline, what you were saying about how to support freelancers, and there is actually also a question here. So how could we manage, or how could the relationship be managed with freelancers and also those on PAYE contracts, and to enable flexibility there or remote working there? You know, the upfront communication, Caroline, that you were talking about is so key, because people, especially in the more vulnerable positions of freelance work, or, you know, of the gig economy, would find it much harder to be outward and say, you know, putting their job on the line, saying, actually, I can't do Fridays, or I need to leave early. But I just wonder what your experience has been with enabling those on freelance contracts or PAYE contracts in the organizations. I know it's, you know, we haven't opened that much to really be looking at it, but did you have any experience?
Yeah, for me personally, the communication is definitely key. Exactly what you were saying is that both times when I was pregnant and I was working, I had very clear, right from the outside, beginning of the job, look, I'm pregnant. I can do this job. I feel confident, but I also want to make sure there's a support network in place in case something happens with the pregnancy, or in case the baby comes early. And I felt like it made that role really successful. I had an assistant. They were super supportive of it. I had somebody in place. With one of my children, I did have a premature babe, so I did actually exit the job, but there was somebody there standing in the wings, ready to step up. So it was a really positive experience. The job was supported, the product was fine, I communicated that really well, and they felt like I achieved the job. Even if I didn't finish getting that product onto the stage, I made sure the product was there and there was no issue. And I think whenever I've spoken to other freelancers, it's definitely been sometimes there's an anxiousness to say I need the support, but oftentimes if you vocalize that and you say, I think it would be a really good idea if we got somebody else to assist me or come in to support me in case I do need to step away. For me personally, it's been really positive. I've had wonderful support from people, but I guess I just wanted to vocalize it because I think sometimes you don't hear it or you don't know it, and there's a lot of freelancers who are anxious because it is their jobs to say, actually, I do need some flexibility, I need some support.
Absolutely. Kate and Deborah, have you what's your experience in supporting?
I think just building what Caroline had said, really, I think that, you know, for large organizations, you have to think about where does the relative or the perceived power in that relationship lie, and I think it can be really difficult for somebody who doesn't know the organisation or is in a freelance role to say, actually, this is what I need. I think that there's a responsibility almost on organisations to start that conversation, to make that very clear from the beginning that this is a conversation that we want to have with you because we want to engage with you as a person, and then to keep that conversation going, and of course follow through on what you've agreed. I mean, that's, you know, there's no point if it's all words. So I think there is a responsibility to make it as easy as possible. And, you know, we've started doing that in our PAYE recruitment, that we will, you know, we're either saying in a job advert or we're saying in an interview, actually, this is our approach to flexible working now, this is what we're doing. And we are taking the onus to start that conversation, because I think sometimes it's too much to put that responsibility on somebody in a more vulnerable position, or where they feel that way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We're doing the same thing as Kate in terms of we are starting the conversation. So we are finding out if somebody has a caring responsibility at application stage or when they're invited to a role, and then we are having usually the person who's hiring them, whether it be me or the producer, is saying, okay, what might you need from us to help? But also by doing that, we give examples of the help that we already do so that somebody knows that it's possible. So we recently had an actor with a young child. And so when they came to work with us, we ensured that their digs, because they had to move to come and work with us, their digs had enough space to have their child, and that, you know, we provided the cot and the bedding and all the things available, so they didn't have to bring them with them. We also had a separate dressing room so that during rehearsals they could spend some time with the child, they could breastfeed if they needed to, that the person they'd arranged to care for the child had a space to be. So we made all those flexible arrangements because we really wanted that actor to work with us, and it made sense. But also I have a 6-year-old, and when I have a board meeting, because it's usually around time for tea time and bedtime, she comes and sits next to me and bad mummy has an iPad and does her reading or watches Netflix on an iPad, but then she comes and waves at the board and they all know her name and they all say hello. So it's about saying that happens already. So what do you need? We are open to it.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot of that. So we do it for new starters and we do it for freelance staff.
Absolutely.
I was just going to add to that in terms of a lot of our charter partners now are looking at how their current policies and frameworks are inquiring to access needs. So they've got a structure to ask about someone's access needs, but actually just unpacking that to its absolute fullest. So really having a process where anybody that comes to work with them get an opportunity from day one or even before day one to basically just say, what is it that you need in order to be able to bring your best and do your best here? And let's just have that conversation, including freelancers. So it's a structured conversation that before you even come in, we're going to ask you to your fullest what it is that you need.
And I would add to that, Matt, and say where it's done best, it's not restricted. It's not about what your care needs, what your access needs. It is absolutely, what do you as an individual need? So just think about those under 30s who are saying flexible working is more important than what I'm paid. You know, there is a whole generation who are coming into the workforce now whose expectations around flexibility and around being enabled to be their best self at work are completely different from what my generation grew up thinking about.
We're going to come to the end of the Q&A, but I just want to pick up on that. I think because somebody mentioned as well, how do you deal with people who might not have the space to work from home? You know, and maybe this is also a good way of saying, you know, what are your needs in terms of space, you know, and offering the space that becomes available in the office, because those who are working now remotely could actually give the space to those who need space to work in an office. I'm really keen to just tackle one more question here before we sort of close up, which is about how do you bring it to senior leadership? So, you know, right now we are obviously talking to organizations who are interested in this organizational change, but what if you are the manager where your senior leadership is not on board? What would be your suggestions to bring that to your senior leadership so that there can be a sort of an organizational review and organizational change being made? This is the golden question.
I'm a bit stumped because our senior leadership were behind it from the start, so I haven't had to deal with a situation where that isn't the case.
If you weren't, so Debra, if you weren't in the senior leadership team yourself, how? No, the other way around. If you weren't on board with it, how would you like that? If somebody from your team comes with a proposal that you might not be completely on board with, how would you? What would you like them? How would you like them to present it to you? What would make it for you?
I think it's about showing what the benefit for the organisation is, rather than the benefit for the. I mean, the benefit for the individual who's asking for it will be clear, but actually highlighting, if I wasn't on board, what the benefit for the organisation is, that makes it kind of irrefutable for why not, if it's a benefit, I think.
Yeah.
I think this is really a really hard one, because if the senior team don't want it, it's very hard to establish it. But if you are a manager within an organisation where the senior people don't want it, remember that, you know, if it's any decent sort of organisation at all, in which case you're wondering why the senior leadership don't want flex, but you would hope that you would have an understanding of that business's or that organisation's purpose and the key challenges it faces. So you're looking for across that, because you can bring the business case till you're blue in the face, but if people aren't interested, the business case just goes, yeah, we get it, and we think we're doing fine. So you have to be able to identify what's the one thing that you think is keeping them awake at night, and that might be about attracting talent, it might be about retaining people, it might be gender pay gap, but you need to try and identify what's the burning platform for your organisation and front up your business case with that. But the other thing to say is that where there is no burning platform, that you probably won't get much change unless somebody in the senior team has got a personal experience that means that they suddenly start taking it seriously. So when the female exec director gets pregnant or something, you know, her whole life changes and her attitude changes. But it is really hard. And in all honesty, if you're a middle manager in an organization, or if you're an employee in an organization that doesn't want to change and you need the flexibility, I just say go. Just leave, you know, and maybe that becomes the burning platform. Maybe your legacy is you've been the critical talent that they've attracted, and you're walking, and your exit interview is saying there was no flex.
Well, that is one way. The other way I would suggest, just to bring this to a good round, is to watch this webinar, because it is recorded, it will be live. And of course, we have the toolkit that you could just slide under people's noses and say, have you seen this? should we have a look at it at our next meeting? We do have to come to a close. It's actually been really insightful and very, very interesting. And I want to thank all of our speakers for here today. We're going to do the poll again, because we're really, really curious to hear how you're now feeling about implementing remote working or managing remote workers now. The answers are pretty much the same. Are you still hesitant and you still don't know and don't think remote working is possible at all in your line of work? Are you, oh, it should come up, the poll, Q poll. It hasn't come up on my screen. There it is, thank you. So again, are you hesitant? You still don't think remote working is at all possible in your line of work? Are you still nervous because you still don't feel you know enough about managing remote workers? Do you now feel positive but still a little bit unsure on how to make it work effectively? Are you confident because you now have some knowledge at least of how to manage remote working? Or do you feel you're now experienced and you have the tools that you need to manage your remote workers successfully? Whichever way it is, we are here to help. Please get in touch with us. Matt is going to put his email address in the chat. So if there's any questions you had that we didn't manage to go through, or anything that comes up later, do get in touch with us. We are here to help. I'm really glad. I'm just seeing some of the poll results that most of you feel confident that you now have some knowledge, and we've got some who still feel a little bit unsure, and some even who feel experienced, but nobody is hesitant or nervous. I'm glad about that. Fantastic. So do look up our working from remote working toolkit online. We've got loads of other resources as well. We've got the flexible working webinar we did earlier with UK Theatre that you can watch, as well as the learning from lockdown. And most importantly, if you think that your organizations could benefit from some support from PiPA, please get in touch with us because we would love to work with you and help you to get on your way. So thank you very much, everybody. And I hope to see you all very soon, or speak to you all very soon in some capacity. I'll say bye-bye, and I think UK Theatre will close the webinar for us.